Hello, everyone, and welcome to BFW 2401, week 10, OBS and derivatives. And now we are talking about part 3. And in this part, we'll discuss actually the derivatives, and we will concentrate in one contract called the future rate agreements. So, and we will talk about it from 3 perspectives, from hedging, speculation, and trading. Let me now go to the first to go to the types of derivatives. So derivatives is a market-related transaction, as I mentioned, because OBS is a market-related. So the value depends on the market value of the underlying assets, like the changes in the exchange rate or the interest rate or the equity market or even the commodities. 90% of the total bank derivatives, 90% of total bank derivatives and OBS is actually in this work of derivatives. Now, we can have contract for foreign exchange and gold contracts, interest rates, equity contracts, and commodity contracts. Actually, we are concentrating and testing here the interest rate. What are the risks? The risks actually is the price risk of those contracts or the change of the underlying assets that will affect the derivative contract. So if you are, for example, making commodity contract, oil, and the FRA, the contract is they call future rate agreement is $60, and then like with the oil is going up now, it's $80 today. Assuming tomorrow is 85, now that increase and the rate and then the underlying asset, which is the $5. If you are a seller of this contract, of course, you will be subject for losses, and you have to pay the $5 difference to the buyer of this contract. So this is what we call the primary risk, is actually the price risk. Now, we call it the price risk. But also when we settle, if we are a seller, and in this case, and I told you the price has gone up, in this case, that will affect the credit quality, it will create credit risk. And we say credit risk specifically when the counterparty, which you go in the contract, especially when we do OTC, which is over the counter, which means from one company to another company, it's out of the Security Commission. So agreement between two parties. If one of the parties default, of course, there is a credit risk. Now, also when you settle the contract, if it's huge contract, and you have to pay it, then that will actually represent a stress on your liquidity. And running these contracts, for example, if you are doing what we call FRA book, which means you sell and you buy and they get the difference. If you had operational mistakes in terms of being exposed, or your exposure is not balanced between the buyer and selling, you can also be subject to huge losses due to the operational risk of operating this trading book. This is when we talk about the risks. Now, interest rate derivatives or interest rate risk, we can do it through forward rate agreements, and I am highlighting this in red font because this is the one that we will do some calculation about it, but I will explain the swap contract, the future contracts, and the options. And remember, we are talking about just interest rate, and you are trying to hedge or speculate on these interest rates. Now, this is the FRA and how it works. So usually there will be a buyer and the seller. Now, the buyer main concern is to sign a contract and state the FRA, which is the fixed rate, say 7%. Now, this is today. Assuming this contract is 90 days or 180 days, later on, when you come and settle after when maturity, the interest rate could be 8% or 5%. Now, if the interest rates goes up and the buyer want always to avoid this credit risk, and this is a hedging contract, so in this case, they want always to pay the 7%. They will still pay the 7%, and the seller will compensate the difference between the 7% and the market rate, which is in this case, the 8%. So the seller will settle with the buyer 1% in this case. Now let's look at the case 2, assuming the price goes down. And if the price goes down, then the seller, you can say give the 55% and receive 7%, but actually the settlement will be the buyer has to pay the seller the difference, which is the 2%. Either way, whether from the buyer perspective, who is actually interested to hedge this changes in the interest rate, it's whether the market will be 8% or 5% or any other number here, he will have always to pay the 7%. His obligation to be 7%, because in this case, if the price goes down, he will pay 5% to his physical market and 2% to his counterpart in this FRA contract. That's all about the FRA contract, and we will have some calculation, and we will show you. So, in the interest rate rises, FRA rate 7%, market 8%, buyer gains 1%. And seller lose 1%. Take the opposite position. I'm talking about this graph. FRA 7%, the market rate is 5%, seller gains, and buyer losses. How much? 2%. Let's go now to the swaps. Now the swaps is interesting because I choose here 2 major banks in this country, and I talked about Public Bank and Maybank. And those people swap their obligation toward the interest rate. Now, I want you to start with Public Bank here. Assuming Public Bank is receiving, he lends or borrows from the public through what we call deposits, either those fixed deposit or retail deposit, which have fixed rate, Now, his obligation to these people is to pay them the fixed rate, which they agree when they open the account. But they take this money, Public Bank, and actually they lend it and make loans to businesses. These businesses actually usually take floating rate. So they want to avoid any changes in the interest rate. They will accept floating rate. Now, the problem will happen when the floating rate, because end of the day, end of the year, for example, those people will pay their dues of the interest rates. And this interest rate could be higher than the fixed rate, that's fine. But if it is less than the interest rate, Public Bank will be, in this case, stuck, because what he receives from here, from the market rate, is not enough to cover the contract with a fixed rate. Assuming he lent and the market rate is 5% and 3%, 5%, and this is 7%. Now, in this case, he is stuck with 2%. Let's go to another bank. Now, Maybank, for example, is taking just the opposite position. The lenders of Public Bank is actually floating rate, assuming he is issuing CDs. Now, the CDs, which is a certificate of deposit, is a floating rate. He takes all this money from the market and gives housing loans and fixed rate. End of the period, the borrowers will give the fixed rate here, and he has to pay to his lenders in the physical market, which is the floating rate. If the fixed rate now is less than the floating rate, which is the market is high now, the Maybank will be stuck. So the perfect position is for those two banks to swap. So what they will swap? They will swap, for example, here, Maybank will receive the fixed rate and he wants only floating rate. He will send it to public bank. And then public bank will give it to his lenders. And whatever he gets, public bank, from the floating rate, he will send it back to Maybank. Now, as you can see, the two banks have solved these problems. Both of them solved the problems. So by this swapping, this makes public bank actually, in the two sides, he received floating rate, not from his borrower, because he is actually swapping. He is receiving fixed rate and paying fixed rate. Same thing happens to Maybank. He will receive the floating rate coming from the borrower. And as I told you before, he will give the fixed rate. So end of the day, he is receiving floating rate and paying floating rate. Problem is solved for both banks. This is actually how the swap works. Now, let's go to the futures. And let's start with some market terminologies. So the future contract is a contract, not a physical contract. It's like actually the forward contract, but it's a little bit, they settle it when the interest rate changes during the life of the contract. So a counterparty who buys a future contract is not actually buying a contract, is not actually buying anything in the point of in time. It's just a promise to buy in the future. So to buy a future contract means to enter into a contract which you will promise to pay to buy in the future. To sell a future contract means to go to a contract which you promise to sell in the future. So example of trading in futures, if a bank buys a bond futures contract, then when it closes its position, it has to sell an equal contract at the new price. The problem is whether the new price will change. Now, if the interest rate falls, bond prices will rise and the bank will sell at profit. Because now he will sell the bonds because the interest rate falls, the prices will go up, so he will sell in profit. If the interest rate rises, then the bond prices will go down and the bank will have to settle that or to sell with losses. I think the buyer of the future contract will profit. As you can see, if market interest rate falls, the seller will lose if the market interest rate falls. Now, if you take the position of interest rates going up, this will lose if the interest rate goes up, and this will gain if the interest rate goes up. Let me give you this example. Maybe this is better. This is a buyer, and let me show you here. This is how the quotation works. The quotation is on price basis, which is calculated as 100. So the contract is at 100. So the example, if the interest rate is 9, so you sell for 91. Therefore, interest rate increases, the price will fall. And if the interest rate falls, the price will increases. So if the interest rate at 5%, it is 95. If the interest rate goes to 11%, the price will be 89. See, the price will go down. So if you are actually a buyer now, then this is a problem. Let's take this example, for example. If you buy 20 contracts at 8% today, which is in March, now the first changes in the interest rate may happen in June. And in June, there is two possibilities. Maybe the interest rate goes up or interest rate goes down. If the interest rate increases by 1% and you want to sell this, because the contract like this, if you buy, you promise to buy, and then when it happens, when you settle, you have to sell the same amount. This is how the contract happens. So if you buy 20 contracts at 8%, in March, you have to sell them in the first changes of the interest rate, which is in June, when the change in the interest rate happens. June or the next auction when the interest rate changes. So now if the interest rate increases by 1%, so it becomes now, the price will become 9% and the price will be 91. And you have to sell, so you bought for 92 and you have to sell for 91. So in this case, there is a loss of $1. What if the interest rate falls to 8% to 7%? If the interest rate falls to 7%, then you have to sell with 93, and in this case you will gain 1 because now you will sell. You bought for 92 and you sold for 93, so you are actually making 1 ringgit or $1. We are done with the future. We just have the options, and the options, we have something called interest rate caps and floors. And when we think about the options of the interest, the caps and the floors, means you have an investors and you have borrowers. Investors bought their money, and there is a limit where they can accept interest rate return. So they make it as the floor, which means if I am putting and the interest rate is 6% now, and I'm investing in 6%, I will put a floor, so for example, which is the minimum for me is 4%. If the interest rate goes below the 4%, that is my floor, and the option have to be exercised, and somebody has to compensate me, which means I will always receive at least 4%. Now, this, we call it the caps, the floors. Let's talk about the caps. And the caps applies to borrowers. So if you are borrowing and you want to hedge the change in the interest rate, so you put a floor, you put a cap, which means the maximum you can pay is 7%. So if the interest rate goes over 7%, 8%, 9%, you have to exercise the option. So that is the maximum you can actually pay, which means if there is anything beyond that cap, somebody, the counterparty will pay you. And this is how the options work. So as you can see, the FRA, futures and swaps result gains or losses depending on the movement of the market prices. For the options, the case is different and the situation is different because different from other derivatives, as they allow holder to avoid market losses while being able to benefit from market gains. So if the price goes up and down, it doesn't work here. It works only you exercise if you are benefiting from this exercising. Here in the caps and the floors, the investors and the borrowers, the investor, for example, as I told you, will exercise only if the price goes under 4. He doesn't have to, to exercise that option. And this one will exercise only if the price goes over the 7%, if his limit is 7%. Now let me talk here about the why banks actually do derivatives. They do it the way they do it. They do it for speculation and arbitraging, and this is there is no physical position in the market. You just speculate on the prices and go on those contracts, and it's a huge business. And they can make arbitraging, which is involved finding product trading at 2 markets and different prices. So they buy at cheaper price market and selling at expensive market to make profit. This is how the the arbitrage work, and the speculation, they just speculate on the prices in the future, and they assume they will benefit from this speculation. Now, the hedging is different because you want to manage risk, which means you are not interested in buying and making profit. But if you are going in a contract, for example, if you are buying commodities like oil and you want to sell them in the future, if in that trading, if something happened to the oil prices, then somebody has to compensate you for the difference. So it's a price risk. So it reduces bank risk. A change in the physical market is actually compensated or offset by an opposite chance in the derivative market. Risk management is when the bank actually buy and sell both of them. Now, in the following slides, we will give some example here, some example here, and some example here. Let's start with the speculation. Now, the speculation, as I told you, we are talking about forward contract. We have the FRA, which is you sign it today, and you wait until the future. And the quotation like this, 3 months B9M. What does it mean? Which means we sign the contract for 9 months, and then we will exercise it after 3 months. So the FRA is 7%, and the contract 500,000. Assuming that after 3 months, the settlement will be happening there when there is a change in the interest rate. So you have a buyer and seller, as you can see, the FRA is 7%, the rate is 7.7%. It increases which means when the market this contract matures after 90 days, 180 days, it's 7.75. As you can see, there must be settlement. And because there is a rise, the seller will compensate the buyer with 75 basis point. Now, to make it in calculation, look at this. So I'm taking this example and trying to do this calculation. So first of all, you will calculate according to 7.75. Now, what is this? Someone would say, what is this? This is how we calculate the present value of this contract. So actually what we are doing here, we are just discounting 500,000 for 180 days, because the settlement, as you can see here, 3 months, it's 9 months, but you will exercise all after 3 months, which means what is left here is 6 months, which is 180 days. So you want to discount this is 500,000 according to the rate, to the actual rate for 500,000, and you see how much is the compensation. So you will discount it according to the new rate. So this is how it must equal according to the new rate. Have you discount it? So it's 481,593, and this is they use this formula actually to count for daily. It's a compounding interest, but this is just a discounting, a time value of money where you discount 500,000 for 180 days using 7.75% rate or discount rate. So you get fined 481. If you do the same thing using the 7%, you will find it to be 483. Now there is a difference between this, and this is where the settlement has to happen, which is 172,180. Who is going to pay to who? Without even thinking, you know, the interest rate goes up in the market, which means the seller has to buy the bidder. The seller has to pay the buyer. And for how much? In terms of dollars, 1721. How did we get it? We get it from this calculation where we calculate according to the 7.75, according to the 7%, and take the difference. And we know that the compensation is actually to be paid by the seller. Now, let me come to another situation. The interest rate is 6%, the market rate, and FRA is 7%. You already know that there is 1% will be compensated from the buyer to the seller. It's just how much that one. So we have to do calculation, and we calculate here according to 6%. We find it for 85, and we calculate that according to 7%. We find that to 483, 3.5, and therefore there is 2,341 will be paid. This is a settlement going from the buyer to the seller. So it has to be paid by the buyer to the seller. As I told you, simply you can know it from here. When the interest rate goes to 6%, you already know from this stage that the compensation will happen from the buyer to the seller. Now, this is how the speculation works, and which means there is no engagement in physical market. It's just you speculate on the rate in the future. And if you are actually have accurate analysis and the smart analysis, and you have the enough expertise, you can actually go to this speculation. Now, let's talk about hedging. And hedging means, actually, I am not intending to speculate or profit from this movement of the interest rate. I just want to hedge my risk. As I told you, I will come back again to the oil price because it's, if, for example, an oil importer in this country make a contract and sell it to someone. For example, Petronas is buying from the Saudis, say 10 million barrel of oil, and each barrel is $80. So you are talking about 800 million. Okay, so you have 800 million contract. So in this case, when you sell, if you make a contract with the government, and you are selling this according to the $80, later on, when the cargo reach to the port, and it is, for example, 8%, you are talking about, and the price is now 85, and you have to settle where in that time, if the contract of the oil of this commodity to settle in that time, you will be receiving to pay to the Saudis, for example, who are the exporters, you will pay 800,000, which actually the original contract, which you received from the government or you are buying it. And the difference, $5 times the 10 million, which is the 50 million. Now you have to receive it from the this FRA contract. This is how the physical works, and the hedging, how the hedging. So you hedge actually the changes in the interest rate and the commodities here, but you also can do it on the interest rate. Now, let me go and show you how it works. For example, here. It's the same calculation. It's the same calculation. Nothing happens. Same calculation, and we know the settlement. But what is happening is actually here. You have here a physical position. And this is your physical market. And this is your bank position, a derivative market. Don't worry about all those numbers and things and whatever. It's just now, assuming is it 7%. Please ignore this area, first of all. And let's talk about this area. Now, the rate is 7%, so you make a contract. In the future, after 3 months, either the interest rates will go up or the interest rate will go down. If it goes up, it could go to 7.75. If it goes down, it could go to 6.2%. Now, if it goes to 7.75%, this is a problem because you only want to pay the 7%, and you want to hedge the increase in the interest rate, which is this 75 basis point. And therefore, you need a counterparty to compensate you. So you already, in this case, when you did it, you started to, you want to hedge these changes in the interest rate. So you go to a contract and you make an FRA contract for 7%. If the prices goes to 7.75, now this counterparty will offset your losses and they will give you how much? Actually the 0.75, but we don't say the 75 basis point, we have to calculate it. And we already calculated. Last time we are saying it's 5 million and it is 180 days. And you calculate according to 7.75 and 6.2, and then you settle here. But now also the calculation is just still the same. Now, assuming now this is the 8%, the prices goes to 6.2, which means 80 basis points have dropped. So in this case, you will have to pay 80 basis points to the seller. So if the interest rate drops, of course, the seller will benefit and he will get the difference between the FRA contract and the market rate, which is 6.2, 7% minus 6.2. So 80 basis points have to be paid to the, and this is, you can see the arrow is here, will pay to the physical market. End of the day, end of this contract, end of this, if you are hedging, you're always as a buyer paying 70%, 7%. You are not, exposed to any risk. And this is how the hedging works. So the hedging, you will have physical market, and you will have a physical market, and you will have a derivative market. And the derivative market will compensate any losses and offset any losses here. I think we have done this calculation before, and I show you when we talked about the 721, and you can do it for any, this is just a repeating for the calculation we did before. This is when you have, when the rate goes to 7.75. It's the same thing. It's too much colors, but it's the same thing. Now let's go to the last point, which is the trading. Now in the trading, it's very interesting. Why? Because the bank stands here, and this is what the huge banks do actually. Huge banks do, they take a position, and then they become, they sell and buy derivatives. And this is what we call risk management. So for example, if you look at this, if a bank runs FRA book, so both buys and sell FRAs, it's quotation, a higher FRA to the buyer and the lower FRA to the sellers. So here the bank become a buyer for this seller, and here the bank is a seller for this buyer. Now, assuming that the FRA, because he quotes higher for the buyers and lower for the sellers, which means now they are out of each risk, out of all those risks. Whatever happens, if he's balancing his contracts, which means his exposure, he doesn't become the market here or here, then in this case, he will do very well. The bank will do very well. So assuming now the FRA, he signed the FRA here when the bank was the seller, 10.5. And he said, here, 10.10 when the bank is the buyer. So assuming now the interest rate goes to 10, because I give you two scenarios, either the interest rate of the market will become 10% or 11%. We will see, is there a difference? Actually, there will be no difference. If it is 10% now, he will have to settle here, right? So if the interest rate 10% and the 10.5 here, of course, here the buyer will pay him 50 basis points. And for these guys, the bank has to pay this guy 10 basis points. Look at it. So he will pay 10%. He will receive 10.5. So he made 50 basis points here out of the total contract. Now, when the bank is a buyer, he will pay 10.10 and he will receive 10. This is the market. So he's actually making losses of 10 basis points. The difference between the 10 basis points and the 50 basis point is 40 basis points. So he's, as a buyer, will receive the market rate when the bank is buyer. He will give his seller, he will receive 10% the FRA and gives to his the counterpart in the contract 10.2, which is in this stage. And in this case, he will receive the FRA and he will receive 10.5 and pay the market, which is 10%. This is when the bank is the seller, because the interest rate goes to down to 10%, is making 50 basis points here, and he's making losses of 10 basis points. The difference is 40. What if the interest rate goes to 11%? Now, he will pay, as a seller, he will pay 11%. And of course, he will compensate it for the 10.5. So actually, he's settling 50 basis points more with the buyer, which is in this stage with this guy. Now let's go what happened to this guy. When the bank is a buyer from another seller, the seller will pay him, he will pay the seller 10.10, which is the FRA, but he will receive the market rate, which is 11%, is making 90 basis points. So the difference between the 50 and the 90 basis point is 40 basis point, which is the same 40 basis points. So regardless whether this rate goes to whatever rate, it doesn't make any difference. Where is the secret or where is the critical issue? It's just your exposure. If your exposure, if you are balancing between your contracts and the seller part and the buyer part, you will never lose. You will all the time gains. The problem is what happened with JP Morgan, Bearing Bank, all those banks who goes to the losses is when they mix up here. They either become the full market as a buyer or a full market as a seller. And when there is any unfavorable changes in the market, they cannot compensate their positions. They just, they are supposed to run a book which is balanced, but if they don't keep this balancing, it became a full market buyer or full market seller, which is then there will be a problem if there is unfavorable move of the interest rate. I'm done. Thank you very much. And I'll just stop sharing here. And this is the third part, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good day.